This is Mark Bruzonsky, and welcome to Mideast Realities. We're at the Adass Israel Synagogue in Washington, D.C., and we're listening to Moshe Ahrens. Moshe Ahrens is one of Israel's leading politicians. He's been the defense minister, the foreign minister, the ambassador to the United States, and he represents the Likud party. One of the myths, of course, is that the Likud party and the Labor Party are two very different parties with very different principles and outlooks. The reality of the situation is that the current prime minister and the current foreign minister of Israel, Yitzhak Rabin and Shimon Peres, have in fact served in Likud governments, with Rabin in fact being the break-their-bones defense minister for Yitzhak Shamir, the last Likud prime minister. Anyway, we've been listening to Moshe Ahrens give his talk. He'll be concluding his talk in the next few minutes, and then he'll be taking questions from a panel of journalists, friendly journalists, and a panel and some questions from the audience. Let's listen in. Indeed, Moshe Ahrens will surely be trying very hard tonight to mask the realities of today's Middle East. So I'll occasionally try to interject a few correctives of my own as we go.
Probably not consciously an effort being made to bring down the Shamir government. Something that actually did happen, and I think was, in some measure at least, connected with the policy that was being practiced by the Bush administration towards the Shamir government. The irony of it all is that shortly after Shamir was defeated in the election, shortly after Likud was defeated in the election in June of 1992, Mr. Bush also was defeated in the elections in November of 1992. Both men were defeated by a very narrow margin, so that it didn't take much to have brought about a different result. And I think, therefore, it is not inconceivable that the fact that many amongst the American electorate who felt dedicated to the U.S.-Israeli relationship and who could not bring themselves to vote for Mr. Bush because the image that had been created of an antagonism, a confrontational posture towards Israel, that many of those who did not vote for him may be for the deciding vote that brought about his defeat. Today we are not far from a second round of elections. Elections in Israel and the United States are usually, not always, held just about at the same time in November, in a year that is divisible by 4. Our elections are now scheduled to be held in November of 1996, just as the coming elections in the United States. And at least by looking at the polls today, it looks like the Labor victory in 1992 might have been almost accidental in nature. Polls in Israel today indicate that the Likud would gain a sizable majority or gain significantly more votes than the Labor Party would. It is important to point out that the platform on which Rabin was elected, by this very narrow margin, he has a 1-vote margin in a 120-member parliament. The platform that he was elected on is totally dissimilar from the policy that he is pursuing. And as a matter of fact, I suppose nobody in Israel would argue with the statement that if Rabin, during the election campaign, had said that he wants to negotiate with the PLO and sign an agreement with Arafat, that he's prepared to give up control over the Golan Heights to Syria, he never would have been elected. There was a total reversal in his position after the election, and whether he really had a moral mandate for what he's doing is something that each and every one of you, I think, can judge for yourself. I think I'm probably running out of the 15 minutes that you've assigned to me, and I'm sure we'll get a chance to get back and talk about many of the things that I've not mentioned. It's no surprise to you to hear that I'm not in agreement with the policies of the present government. I think the Oslo Agreement was a very bad mistake. I think that is becoming apparent to many, possibly even to Mr. Rabin, who was a signatory to that agreement. And if you ask yourself, now what was behind that mistake? And many people in Israel went along with Mr. Rabin, saying, after all, this man has so much experience. This man has devoted so much of his life to the defense of Israel. He's been chief of staff, he's been defense minister, he's been ambassador to the United States, he's been prime minister in a previous tenure. Let's go along with him. He must know what he's doing. Nevertheless, the question is asked, well, how is it that a mistake like that was made, or what was behind it? I think the answer to that is that it was basically a misconception based on abandoning a realistic view of what the Middle East is all about, of the societies that we're confronting, of the fact that this is not just an ethnic conflict between Jews and Arabs, that this is a conflict between two cultures, that the culture that characterizes much of the Arab population living in the area is a culture of violence. It's a culture that breeds terror. It's a culture of intolerance. And although I'm sure this will change, I'm not despondent, and I don't think that the Middle East and the Arab world will remain frozen in this present state forever, as far as the eye can see. There's little doubt in my mind that it takes a long time for such changes to take place. And although Mr. Peres has gone around, and maybe still goes around saying this is a new world, and this is a new Middle East, and everything has changed, and defensible borders aren't important anymore, that change has not arrived yet. And unfortunately, it's taken some very terrible terrorist incidents in Israel recently. The last one at Beit Lid near Netanya 2 weeks ago, to shake everybody up and bring them back to their senses, to face the difficult and sad reality of the Middle East. Thank you.
Thanks very, very much, Ambassador Ahrens. I'm just going to say a couple of brief things about each of our panelists. I have a longer bio of each person here, but I think that you all know them. Margaret Warner is now Chief Washington Correspondent for the McNeil-Lehrer NewsHour. We've all seen her on CNN's Capitol Gang. She was diplomatic correspondent for Newsweek, and she also covered the White House at one time. She is deeply experienced in Middle Eastern affairs. Margaret, why don't you start off with the first question?
Great. I want to call you Mr. Minister because the whole time the three of us traveled with Secretary Baker and went to Israel many, many times. You were a minister rather than an ambassador. And what you should know about the three of us is that we've probably had more cups of coffee together in the King David lobby than most of us care to remember, waiting for Minister Ahrens and Mr. Baker and others to come out and tell us what was really going on. I think probably most people in the audience would really like to hear about what you think, where Israel should be headed now, but let me just ask you one question about what you deal with in your book. You said that you thought that Bush and Baker really helped engineer the downfall of the Shamir government. Could you tell us just briefly 2 or 3 things that you thought contributed to that, or do you really feel that it brought about the downfall of the government, apart from many, many other factors that were at work there?
Some things are coming to light even now, after more than 4 years have passed, and one that doesn't relate directly to your question, but is indirectly related to it, is the fact that the Labour Party and Labour Party leaders had contacts with the PLO during the time that they were members of the National Unity Government led by Yitzhak Shamir, during a time when this was illegal Israeli law, and that they had contacts with the PLO just prior to the Israeli elections in an attempt to get the PLO to use its influence to increase the number of votes that the Labour Party would get from the Arab population in Israel, who are Palestinians in every sense of the word, except for the fact that they are citizens of Israel. I mention that only because in the book I point out that Labour Party leaders, ministers in our government, sitting with us around the government table, were in contact with the administration here, and to some extent participated in collusion behind the backs of the people who are officially designated by the Israeli political system to represent the State of Israel, the Prime Minister and the Foreign Minister. But I think the outstanding example, which no doubt had a direct effect on the election results in Israel, was the question of the loan guarantees. And I know that frequently this has been misunderstood or sometimes even misrepresented as having been a request by Israel for $10 billion of additional aid over and above the aid that it had gotten in past years from the United States. Actually, as the name implies, it was a request for the United States government to provide guarantees for loans that Israel would take from banks or financial institutions and that Israel would repay, so no significant amount of money was required. And these loan guarantees were asked for by Mr. Shamir in order to help Israel cover the cost of absorbing the over 500,000 immigrants that arrived in Israel during those years from the Soviet Union or the republics that were once part of the Soviet Union. And so there was this great human dimension in this issue. And Mr. Shamir made, in my view, a tactical mistake in that he explained to the people of Israel that these loan guarantees were absolutely essential for Israel's future. Absolutely essential for Israel to be able to absorb the immigrants that were so badly needed and who needed Israel as a haven that were coming to Israel. Now, the Bush administration, President Bush, made it perfectly clear that if there was one man in Israel who would never get these guarantees, it was Mr. Shamir. And this was just on the eve of the elections, and there's no doubt that the signal that was sent that the Labour Party would get these guarantees, but the Likud would not, had a significant effect on the election outcome.
But if I could just follow up, my recollection was that what the Bush administration wanted was absolute guarantees that the loan guarantees wouldn't be used to settle any immigrants or current Israelis in the territories. And I guess my question is, do you think in the midst of this whole Madrid process, which is when this all took place, the United States could have permitted its backed loans to be used for that purpose and still been regarded by the Arab parties as an impartial negotiator, as a whatever the phrase was, a negotiator in good faith?
Well, the administration, Secretary Baker personally was given ironclad assurances in my presence by the Prime Minister that these loans, guaranteed by the U.S. government, would not be used to fund settlement efforts in Judea, Samaria, or Jerusalem. And Mr. Bush made a point of the fact that he opposed any building in the eastern part of Jerusalem as well. It wasn't just a question of Judea and Samaria. And the response we got from Secretary Baker was, he said, money is fungible. I think this was the first time that Mr. Shamir learned what the meaning of the word fungible was. And he said, it doesn't matter if you say you're not going to use the loan money for settlements, it'll make other money available, and we're not going to be a party to that. Well, I've been asked frequently whether this is not justified. If the United States provides Israel with assistance, in this case with guarantees, and under other circumstances with actual grants, doesn't the United States have a right to demand of Israel that it change its policy, that the government of Israel change its policy? Well, it may legally have that right, but in my view, this is totally off the mark and it's unprecedented. Because after all, there have been in the past, I'm sure there will be in the future, differences of opinion between Israel and the United States. Difference of opinion between the United States and other democratic countries, the United States and France, the United States and Britain. But I think that it has not been done, and it should not be done, in terms of the interests of the United States, of the country involved, of the relationship between these countries, that assistance that is given be utilized as a lever in order to force a democratically elected government to change its policies. The Reagan administration was never crazy about settlements in Judea and Samaria. But it never used that issue as a lever or as a hammer to beat Israel over the head and to try to force its government to change its policy. Mr. Bush knew enough about Israeli politics to know that Mr. Shamir, in the political scene as it existed in Israel, in terms of the beliefs that Mr. Shamir had, was not capable of making that change. And so in effect what he was saying is, you're not getting these guarantees as badly as the Russian immigrants might need them.
Our next questioner is Barry Schweid, but before I introduce Barry, I just want to note that you all are invited to submit questions on blue index cards, and I was reminded to tell you about that. I was not reminded as to how you get the blue index cards. where are even orange index cards? What is the procedure, Jeff? If someone wants to ask a question, raise your hand. We will pass out a card, and we will select the most tasteless questions, and I will repeat them. Barry Schweid is now Senior Diplomatic Correspondent for the Associated Press. He's only held that position for 21 years.
The cub reporter for
right. We've all heard him on NPR, I'm sure, many times. He's been to the Middle East more than 100 times. He's covered about 100 U.S.-Soviet summits. He, too, is a most distinguished expert on the issues that we're considering today. Barry, how would you like to ask another several questions?
I was going to suggest, Mr. Ahrens, if you think the players in your time were nimble, you should have been around the Kissinger period. But suppose the polls are right, and suppose the liquid comes roaring back.
Louder, please.
All right. Gee, I missed my joke. Suppose the polls are right, and suppose Likud comes roaring back. Aren't you caught, as democracies sometimes are, between a rock and a hard place? In other words, you have commitments now. This government has made commitments. Gaza is turned over already. Jericho is. There are commitments to keep withdrawing on the West Bank. And as far as I understand, every Israeli government is bound by the commitments of its many predecessors. So suppose Likud comes back. What could you do about, what is it called these days, land for peace, territorial compromise, whatever? Could you change it?
I think that as regards the commitments that have been made so far, there is really no insoluble problem that the Likud would face, because the Oslo agreement made with the PLO specifies that negotiations for the permanent status of Judea, Samaria, and Gaza will be held at a time which turns out to be in the calendar, the election time in November of 1996. And it is really only in these negotiations that the kind of commitments could be made that in terms of adherence to international commitments would be irreversible. So as far as that's concerned, and since nobody, I would add in his right mind, thinks of returning to Gaza, I would say no irreparable or terminal damage, in my view, has been done. The area of concern is the Golan Heights. If the Rabin government were to sign an international agreement with the Syrian dictator abandoning the Golan Heights, that would be the kind of international commitment that maybe a different government would not find itself capable of going back on, regardless of how it disagreed. And my own personal nightmare has been throughout this past year, these past months, that I would open the paper one morning and find that that agreement has been signed. Because there's no doubt, in my mind at least, that despite Rabin's campaign promises, that he would not abandon the Golan Heights. As a matter of fact, he said anybody that abandons the Golan Heights is risking the very security of the state of Israel. There's no doubt in my mind that a clear message has been sent to Damascus and to Washington that the Rabin government is prepared to abandon all of the Golan Heights. They have some subsidiary requirements about the schedule of withdrawal and about the elements of the peaceful relations that need to be established, but the agreement in principle is there, and the only reason that the agreement has not been signed is because Assad has evidently not been ready to make the right moves and to smile in the right direction. Here we could have a problem area, but so far the agreement has not been signed, and I was a little encouraged to hear from Mr. Peres, who was on the airplane with me, that he thought the outlook was not very promising. And I was glad to hear that.
You are speaking. You are speaking. You and Mr. Peres, having read your book.
Oh yes.
Well, you're not going to find that tomorrow morning unless something's going on in Oslo that we don't know about on the Golan Heights. But the die is cast, isn't it, on the Palestinians? I mean, your and Mr. Shamir's hopes to find a new Palestinian leadership, some alternative to the PLO. The PLO was on the ropes, but indeed this government revived the PLO, revived Yasser Arafat. There's no turning back from that, is there?
I'm not sure that that's the case, because it's not at all clear that Yasser Arafat could get elected in free and democratic elections amongst the Palestinian population. He's certainly facing a great deal of opposition from many directions, by the way, not only from the Muslim fundamentalists, but also from many Palestinian intellectuals who have assimilated, maybe some superficially, the norms that govern Israeli society, who have seen a democratic system at work, who've seen the free press, who've seen respect for civil liberties, and they don't like what they see when they look at Arafat's leadership. I don't think Arafat is very eager to hold elections. As a matter of fact, I understand that whatever elections in quotation marks are being discussed are not going to be elections for his position. He considers that already assured. He doesn't feel that he needs a mandate from the people. But my own prognosis is that he is not a permanent fixture out there as leader of the Palestinian population. What will come in instead? I don't know. My thesis has always been and continues to be that we must negotiate with people who have a mandate from the Palestinian population. And when somebody says to me, well, whoever will be elected in true elections, maybe even worse than Arafat, maybe Hamas, maybe Muslim fundamentalists, I say, so be it. If it turns out that the majority of the population does not want peace with Israel, then we're not going to solve anything by signing an agreement with somebody who doesn't represent that majority. Nothing will come of it anyway.
Thank you. Our final panelist, and we'll have more than 3 questions, of course, is John Goshko. John has been a reporter for The Post for more years than needs to be related. He spent 11 of those years as a foreign correspondent, and he headed the Post's first bureau in Washington in the 1970s. He was the Post diplomatic reporter for 18 years, covering the work of the Secretary of State and other foreign policy figures and issues. He has focused principally on the Arab-Israel conflict in his work as a correspondent in the Middle East. I'm sure he has many questions also.
Yeah, Mr. Minister or Mr. Ahrens, I'd like to pursue a point where you left off with your last answer. Assume arguendo is a way to say that we have an election in Israel and the Likud is returned to power. Now, what would, you said in part that your response of the Likud government would be to negotiate with the people who are representative through elections that they are. But what would be the Likud's position in dealing with them? One of the fundamental differences that you have had between Likud, which is my understanding of all the conversations that I've had with you and other members of the bloc, is that in some not yet specifically defined way, the West Bank, or Gaza and Judea and Samaria, excuse me, should be permanently associated with Israel. Whereas the United States position has been, ever since 1967, that a solution should be predicated on the land for peace, swapping territory for peace with the Arab world. How would you, this time around, how would the Likud attempt to bridge the gulf between U.S. policy and its basic position?
Well, the question, as far as we're concerned, is really not one of bridging the gulf between U.S. policy and our policy, but one of addressing in an effective manner the problem that we in Israel face. And I, as foreign minister, or I, as just a plain Israeli, have frequently been angered and frustrated when people from other countries, including the United States, preach to me the importance of making peace in the area. Nobody wants peace more than Israel. It may be important for the United States to have peace in the Middle East, but I think nobody will argue that it's far more important for Israel. We have paid the highest price of all for the absence of peace, with the lives of our sons. And if peace has not been achieved in the 46 years of Israel, 48 years of Israel's existence, it's not been for lack of trying. It's been because of Arab aggression. And we continue to try, and I think we're making progress, and we'll continue to make progress. But that's really the problem that we face. It's one that I think needs to be looked at, and justifiably so, in terms of our perspective, and not in terms of what other people are urging us to do. Now, as regards the question itself, let me first address two that are relatively easy to address as regards to Likud's position, and then go on to the one that is far more difficult. And I think it's important to understand that it is difficult. There's no easy solution and no shortcut. As regards the Golan Heights, I think I've already stated my position. I think it would be utter folly on the part of Israel to give up control of this so important strategic position that overlooks the northern part of Israel.